You're listening to the Skylight Books podcast. We're an independent, general interest bookstore putting great reads in the hands of people in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. Hosted by resident Skylighters, we're here to bring you new and exciting author conversations, group reads, and bookseller chats. Happy listening.
Hello, and welcome back to the Skylight's Book Podcast. I'm Tyler, a bookseller at Skylight Books on 1818 Vermont Avenue. Thank you all for joining us here today for our new episode. I want to quickly introduce our guest, Alexandra Lange. She's a design critic and author. Her work has appeared in Bloomberg City Lab, Curbed, D-Zine, and Design Observer, as well as in The New Yorker and The New York Times. Her previous book, published in 2018, was The Design of Childhood, How the Material World Shapes Independent Kids. And she's here today to discuss her new book, Meet Me by the Fountain, which is all about malls, the history of malls, and it's absolutely fascinating. So I wanted to prompt Alexandra to read a little bit from her book to get us started today.
Sure, thanks. I'm going to read right from the beginning of the book as a kind of mood-setting piece. So I'll just go ahead and do that. Why we go to the mall. From the Turnpike, the American dream was a great gray blob. An earlier version of this mall, then named Meadowlands Xanadu, had worn its tacky heart on its sleeve, its vast expanse a riot of blocks and stripes of color, the patterns dramatizing the precipitous angle of the indoor ski slope as it rose from the parking lot. But now the building reposed glumly on the roadside horizon, less distinct than the green sweep of the Meadowlands or the bowl of MetLife Stadium, home of the New York Giants. Only in one spot, the outward curve of the Nickelodeon roller coaster, did American Dream's facade break its dourness, as if this ride alone could not be contained. Inside, despite my multi-year study of the history of malls, I found myself lost. Atrium seemed to follow atrium, one with a chandelier, one with a vaulted wood ceiling, one with a plastic garden, without any sense of hierarchy or connection back to the outdoors. Long halls papered with photographs suggested that one day glamorous stores might follow, but the stores that were there, Zara, Bath and Body Works, Amazon 4-star, weren't anything I needed to leave New York City to visit. Down in the lower level, near the mini golf and the aquarium, signs of life. The scent of Auntie Anne's, a pastel boba storefront, masked families on their travels to the ski slope, to the indoor beach, to the candy store. After more than a year of quarantine, largely confined to my Brooklyn neighborhood, I found myself touched and thrilled by their linked hands. In May 2021, when it seemed like the summer might bring an end to the COVID pandemic, seeing parents and children out and about having fun together brought me a spike of joy. I wanted to see people, I wanted to watch people, I wanted to be among people. We were all seeking that at the mall. So I'm going to stop there.
I think that's perfect.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect place to start. And so to kind of follow up on that, and I think, you paint such a nice picture of that mall, even though it is kind of maybe too modern. It's not your favorite mall, I'll say.
Yes, not my favorite mall.
Not your favorite mall, but there is something like sense memory triggering about just hearing the word Auntie Anne's, I think.
Yes.
And so I wanted to kind of start also by maybe prompting you. You kind of also described this in the book in great detail, but I figured I'd give you a chance to talk about it here. Is like, what was your first mall, and like what was so special about it?
My first mall was Northgate Mall in Durham, North Carolina. That's where I grew up. And Northgate Mall, as I say in the book, was an extremely ordinary mall. Like the anchor stores were a Belk's and a Sears. It had a Radio Shack. It had a McDonald's. It had a Carousel. It had a Spencer Gifts. Like very like middle to lower middle class stores. And in the book, I talk about going there to do back to school shopping at the Sears. And I think shopping for kids and teenagers is a really important important part of identity formation. And so, yes, it's shopping, yes, it's commercialism, but you're also trying to like figure out who you are through what you are choosing to go back to school in. And an important moment for me was in that Sears, where I realized that all of the pink puffy coats in the girls department really did not suit me at all. And I realized I could just go over to the boys department where they had lovely gray chore coats with a flannel lining, which I bring up because those are back in style now. And I picked that and I wore that to school. And it was like, oh, okay, I'm making a choice here in this store at the mall to be this sort of person rather than that sort of person.
Yeah. And that's kind of what the mall offers you, right? Is that like, it gives you so many choices and options. Obviously, that's sort of the beauty of it. Now you said something there that, and I think it's why I was drawn to your book in such a way is I love like these stories, the behind the scenes stories of things you interact with so often. So like you use the phrase anchor store. Like, can you explain just like the concept of anchor store and how like malls have these different shapes? Some of them are X's, some are T's, and it's things that like I guess I've always known but never had seen put into words before.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think even sometimes these words we hear together, like anchor store, like you've heard that before, but you don't think about what it really means, and it actually has an important business meaning. In the early development of the mall, basically developers would approach department stores that were located downtown in whatever city the mall was going to be in a suburb of, and get them to sign on to be the first businesses in the mall, the anchor businesses. And they would raise the rest of the money to develop the mall off the allure of getting a Hudson's or a Belk's or a Neiman Marcus or whatever at the mall. So they're literally anchoring the business deal, and then they're also physically anchoring the mall because the simplest malls had 2 department stores, one at each end. And so they're kind of in an I shape with just like a run of stores between the 2 department stores. Then you go slightly larger and you can get an L shape where, there's 3 stores, one at each of the intersection points, or a T shape where there's one off to the side. Then sometimes people want to expand the mall and they'll end up in a V shape or a W shape. Like in each of these is like new large store and then a run of facing shops going off of it. And one of the reasons I think a lot of people say they're confused by malls is that they tend to be going to malls in like the 90s and 2000s. And a lot of those malls have completely lost that original shape and that original simplicity because they've been added onto so much over the years.
Yeah, it becomes a little bit like a maze, and sometimes, and if you don't have the knowledge, I guess in my mind, like as a kid, also when you're going, I'm like, well, there's the Nordstrom, and then there's this, you just don't know. You're like all turned around in that way because you don't think of them as like a North Star of the mall. To be like, I'll be back to you. More appropriately, you think of the fountain as like a place where you're like, okay, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go there, and we'll meet back there. I was going to say, it's so funny. Like when I've been telling people that I've been reading this book, and everyone's been telling me, and I'm sure you mentioned this in the book. Everyone's been telling you about their mall experiences, and I had a friend who told me a very funny one, and I quickly share is like, because that's the thing when you say picking your identity as a teen. Like a lot of teenagers like still go to the mall with their families, but they know their friends are there and they still want to look cool. So he would like get to walk like 4 or 5 feet ahead of his family to like look like he was on his own. But then his younger sister didn't understand why he was walking so far ahead. And so she would like call out to him and be like, hey, come back. That's just further embarrassing him in front of any potential friends or girls who might be looking at him. So, yeah, I mean, it's just such a like woven into the fabric of being a teenager, certainly. But so going way, way back, because I love how well researched this book was. You go all the way back to France and like the very beginnings of department stores, which I thought was so fascinating. But specifically, is Victor Gruen.
Yeah, Victor Gruen.
Victor Gruen is sort of like would you call him the grandfather of malls? Yeah,
father or grandfather malls. I'd say he's the first great mall innovator. And there were other people that were working at the same time as he was, but one of the reasons we know his name and he was so successful is that he was a showman. Like now we kind of expect our business leaders to be charismatic and really know how to sell things. And Victor Gruen was very much in that mode. Like he was an architect, but he ended up being more like a public figure and a public salesman for the idea of the mall. But as an architect, just to give you like a little biography, Gruen was a Viennese emigre. He fled the Nazis and came to the US, to New York City specifically in 1938. And he was already trained as a modern architect. So some of his first architectural projects in the US were very beautiful little boutiques in New York City. If you look at pictures of them, it's kind of like they're these beautiful jewel boxes for, leather goods, jewelry, candy, and other things. So he had a lot of design sensibility, and he was already working in the commercial sector. And then he hooked up with the people behind a minor department store chain known as Grayson's, who gave him a lot more runway and started flying him around the country to pick new sites for department stores and design those. So he learned a lot about, retailing in America, suburbs in America, like, the development of markets. And after the war, he realized that a lot of the downtown merchants that he was looking at, their stores were starting not to fail, but to, basically have less customers because the US was building all of these suburbs and people did not want to drive all the way back into town to shop. So how could he get these department store owners who, had these gorgeous stores and looked at the suburbs as kind of like ugly and desolate, to move out there, because he knew it would be better for their business for them to be closer to the new homeowners. So his solution was the shopping mall, because the shopping mall was supposed to be more like a town square or a European street. And it also gave those department store owners more control over the surroundings for their stores. Like they wanted their stores still to be these jewels, but now they could say, okay, when you exit our store, we're going to exit onto this concourse, and it's going to have beautiful landscaping. It's going to have sculpture. It's going to have a fountain. And that made them feel more secure in moving out to the suburbs.
Yeah, I thought that was so interesting. You draw this great parallel, almost like the history of the mall and sort of the history of America being sort of tied, parallel to each other. So in terms of the way that suburbs are built, and I don't think this was ever Victor Gruen's intention, but it's so interesting that the mall is this thing that sort of essentially the hole that he's filling is like white flight is leading to these people having nowhere to go. And so with that being the need, he fills it with this. And obviously then there are a lot of other things that societally that they're, the mall has a very particular type of customer. And I don't think that was ever his intention, but that seems to be like, that's what the mall does for its kind of first 2 decades, is it just sort of weeds out a certain type of customer, and it targets a very specific type of customer, one that you talk about a lot.
Yeah, no, that was definitely one of the interesting things to discover as I did my research. Number one, the idea that we can't talk about post-war development without talking about the mall, but most urban histories really focus on roads and housing and not on the mall as this third space. So I was like, first of all, the mall is actually super important. It's not a side note. I think that the mall made the suburbs bearable for a lot of people. And so it has a real psychological and social component. But then on the other hand, yes, the suburbs, were essentially financed by low interest mortgages available to US servicemen, but only white US servicemen. So the people moving into those houses were young white families. And so the people going to the malls were white women and children. And I haven't found any evidence of kind of, colored drinking fountains or things like that at malls, but where they were placed, the neighborhoods they were adjacent to, and then also the lack of public transportation to many of the malls made them basically white spaces.
Yeah, exactly. And that was the other thing that I even found interesting as well, where you were saying, so the developers would, eventually were sort of encouraged to buy, way more acreage than they would need, so that then they could either, I mean, and obviously they'd sort of had these big grand designs to, build it out with everything you'd ever want around a mall as well. But usually they just got sold off to developers to build more single family homes that only seemed to exacerbate the problem.
Yeah, I mean, Gruen thought that he could build new cities with malls as the center, and he has a lot of plans for that in some of his books and, articles and writings. But it was just financially easier for people to keep doing the same thing that they were doing, and cheaper to build single family homes than, high rises or office buildings or medical complexes. So his original ideas really kind of fell by the wayside. And at a certain point in the 1970s, he actually started, talking about how upset he was and kind of disavowing his authorship of the mall.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. So then moving into the 70s, you talk a lot about the Nasher family.
Mm-hmm.
What was their mall in Dallas? I'm the name escaped me.
Yeah, it's North Park in Dallas,
Yeah.
Which is it was developed by the Nasher family in the mid 1960s and is still family owned. So yeah, I spend a lot of time on it, partially because it's a very beautiful example of architecture, and partially because it's one of the few malls that opened in 1965 where you can actually still see what it looked like in 1965. Malls, like the things that they sell, are kind of built to be transformed, built for endless upgrading. So to go to a mall that still has the same concrete floors and the same brick walls as in 1965 is actually really fascinating, and just the scale and materials of it are very beautiful, but also like have a period feeling that you can't get other places.
Absolutely. And you talk about it in depth about it as well, that one of the big sort of innovations of that mall was sort of, again, the family involvement and the upkeep and the sort of set design standard that sort of carries throughout, and how they just keep a very close and sort of watchful eye over every little detail of it, which, and again, the art collection and all these sort of things that now seem very commonplace.
Yeah, so the Nasher family are also the founders of the Nasher Sculpture Center, which is like an amazing sculpture museum in downtown Dallas. So they own a lot of sculpture, and they're constantly rotating and showing like really excellent modern and contemporary sculpture in the mall. So it's like a free museum. But yeah, no, they were also very generous with their time. So they allowed me to get some insight into the kind of design standards that you can have if you run a mall. One thing, like they never have Muzak or other interior music. They don't allow little sandwich boards or things outside stores. And so once you've been to North Park and thought, why is this so nice? Why does it seem so pristine? Then you go to other malls and you're like, oh, they allow sandwich boards. Like there is like music overhead, and then you go into a store and there's loud music. And, there are all these things that, mall owners can use to keep their mall looking a certain way, but, not every mall cares about that.
Are they also don't have like the kiosk people?
No, they don't have
Yeah.
kiosks.
Yeah.
No kiosks. I mean,
which I feel like,
kiosks can be really important. I got my ears pierced at a piercing pagoda, which was a kiosk. And there are often ways for small business owners, new business owners to get a foothold in the mall. So I don't hate kiosks. North Park's also scale wise, like the distance of the concourse from side to side is smaller than a lot of places, and I think the kiosks work best when you have a really wide concourse, so there's plenty of room to have like a whole walking aisle on either side of the kiosk. I think you can visualize that.
Yeah. And no disrespect to kiosks. I've had my glasses cleaned like they've never been at mall kiosks, but also you do get a lot of the you get sort of solicited a lot, and that I think is something that maybe I could see how the Nasher family would not have wanted that for people.
I don't think they really want airbrush t-shirts sold in their mall.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and it was another one of the things that really struck me about your book, or really drew me to your book initially, was in 2020 from June to November, I worked at a coffee shop in a mall and actually something I think you described later as a lifestyle center, and I'm sure we'll talk about those more later, but it was a Rick Caruso run Pacific Palisades like mall center, and I'll never forget it. We were like it's a very small coffee shop chain here in LA that's like known for like having neon and, you know, kind of like big flashy stickers and sayings and things. And one day we just had, I guess there was a tiny little sticker in the bottom of our glass front window, and a guy in a very expensive suit comes over and goes, "You got to take that out right now. That can't be there. Doesn't match the design." Also, they really fought us on, because it was the middle of the pandemic and people were like, why, you know, we had shortened our hours from like 8 to 12 or something, kind of prime coffee drinking hours we had felt. And they're like, "Your contract says you have to be here till 7 p.m. And if you don't, we'll bounce you." And so, I mean, you know, they really like certain people in these mall design, like there's a real iron fist quality to the design standards as well, which I think is so interesting.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, especially what, you know, we have learned from the Rick Caruso mayoral campaign.
Yes.
Just about like who he wants to attract to his campaign and who he wants to have at his malls, and that does not really include everybody.
I'll say my first day working there after a few months off, I just remembered this. Because of the pandemic, they closed all the stores, and then I got moved to this one. It was right in the middle of the George Floyd riots, and I drove to work, and which was again in the Pacific Palisades, which is a beautiful suburb and very expensive suburb of Los Angeles. And there were National Guardsmen guarding the mall. I think Rick Caruso might have pulled some strings on that one.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's a pretty wild situation there. But anyway, we'll bounce away from that for now.
Yeah.
So one of the other really interesting things, and kind of incorporated in this as well, because the Pacific Palisades, what he bought was a place that sort of existed as a main street. He bought it and then imposed his design on it and everything. So something that seems to happen in the second wave of malls that you talk about that I found really interesting was that it became downtown revitalization. That all these people who had noticed that the malls had pulled people from downtown, had kind of hurt downtown, decided, well, maybe we can take a bunch of rundown buildings or a harbor front, and we can put in some local shops and businesses. And then that became a whole trend in malls for a really long time. And I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah. It's really interesting how cyclical all of these things, like there is a fashion cycle to retail and retailing ideas too, which, you know, again, seems obvious, but maybe not till you point it out. But yeah, in the 1970s, all those downtowns where the department stores used to rule the roost now had too few people. You know, it was just office workers kind of scuttling in, scuttling out, and not feeling really safe or interested in going out on the street and spending money. So the main innovator in that sector is another developer named James Rouse, who was mostly based out of Baltimore. And he teamed up with the designers, Ben and Jane Thompson, to create this concept called the Festival Marketplace. And the most famous one of those is Faneuil Hall in Boston, which, you know, maybe everyone's been to on some sort of heritage tour. But that was a bunch of old brick market and warehouse buildings near the waterfront in Boston, and they made a pedestrian street in between them, and they carefully curated the businesses within them to be local businesses, food businesses, crafts. And if you look at period photos of it, there are banners flying. I used to go there as a kid because we lived in Boston when I was really little, and there were always jugglers or other things on the street. So it really felt like a fair all the time, and it was a destination from, you know, the suburbs of Boston also when you had visitors. And that became a template for a lot of downtowns. Rouse and the Thompsons also did South Street, Seaport, and Harbor Place in Baltimore. And then you can just see a million other versions of this, kind of taking existing historic architecture, pedestrianizing the street in between, and giving it a label. And in fact, underneath, there's also a different business proposition where, you know, one entity owns it and probably has their own maintenance staff and their own security. And that's where you get into these, you know, ambiguous situations where it seems like you're on a public street, but you're actually in like a privately run part of the city.
Right, which you talk about, like, yeah, you've sort of left the jurisdiction. You've entered a new jurisdiction, basically.
Yeah.
And I thought, and so when reading this, and you kind of set this up, the scene really nicely of like what this is and what it's doing, and I couldn't help but think like, well, what does this do to the people who were living in this part of town who were possibly, patronizing businesses that were previously there. And then you kind of pay this off beautifully by explaining that the very first use of the word gentrification was in New Yorker magazine was sort of like, it was like in regards to retail, which I thought was so interesting that it's like, yeah, it kind of was almost a forerunner. It was like, this all sounds so familiar, basically.
Yes. Yeah. It's like, I mean, one of the things that's fun as a writer and something that I hope my book does is just kind of tie together all of these pieces of information that like many people like have in their heads, but you don't see how they're connected. And, as an architecture critic, to me, they're always, connected in a space or connected by a place. And I think it's really clear with this idea of gentrification. It's like, what is the cost of entry? Like, what's the cheapest thing that you can buy in this shopping world? And if it's a cup of coffee for, $1 to $2, that's one thing. But if it's a fancy cup of coffee that starts at $5, like that is a completely other thing. And another just community thing that I talk about in a different part of the book is communities of mall walkers in suburbs. And for them, like a cheap cup of coffee at the end of their morning routine is really important. And that's why mall walking is really an activity and an exercise for older people that cuts across class lines.
Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. So it was just very interesting to see where, like, right, exactly, the point of entry became, where it was like, right, at first it was, thousands of acres, like the Eddie DeBartolo Sr., where it's like basically wherever two freeways meet. And then, yeah. Which I thought was so interesting. And Eddie DeBartolo is a very interesting figure for me personally as well. So, it starts there, and then eventually over time, like you say, everything is so cyclical. It just was like, and then we'll move back to downtown, and then we'll move to, it was a kind of a fascinating. I would never have thought how again closely tied or even what a forebearer something like this kind of retail was for, eventually living spaces and things like in the way, the kind of the way that the things are moving. So I guess one of the things in the architecture of all this is so interesting. You learn a lot of names when you look into like architecture design, because I think that's sort of the trade-off of being an architect is your building stands, but maybe people don't know who you are. And so one of the names, so there's John Jardy. Jardy, who's another sort of interesting figure who kind of comes along and possibly innovates what the mall can be. But he gained a lot of insight and inspiration from a name that I definitely recognized, which was Ray Bradbury, which I thought was so fascinating. Obviously, the author of Fahrenheit 451 and the Martian Chronicles. And I was just like, so it was so interesting to see those two people sort of linked. And I guess I'd just give you a chance to speak on that.
Yeah. So Ray Bradbury, was an LA person, like a very LA person. He moved here as a teenager, and there as a teenager. And he had a lot of nostalgia for the Los Angeles of the 1930s and 1940s, when the city was really more a city of villages, I think, and the streetcars were more in effect. But by the early 70s, things had become more spread out. And he started to feel that even within the environs of Los Angeles, there was no there. And he wrote this great essay basically talking about like the plazas of Mexico and how Los Angeles really needed plazas like that, essentially with anchor businesses at each corner and people selling food and et cetera, et cetera. And John Jardy, who was then a young architect, for a time worked for Charles Kober and Associates, which developed the Glendale Galleria. He read this piece and thought, he is talking about what I want to build. Like, he just felt that like here was kind of an inspirational text for the way he thought malls ought to be and like what they could do for the city of LA. So a few years later, he was hired to do a mall scheme for downtown San Diego. And he called up Ray Bradbury and said, like, would you write essentially like a tone poem for the redevelopment of downtown San Diego? And Ray Bradbury wrote something. It's a piece called The Aesthetics of Lostness. And it talked about actually the pleasure of getting lost, that's something we do when we travel. And, could we kind of have it in our own backyard? And Jurdy used that as the foundation for his design for Horton Plaza in downtown San Diego, which has unfortunately now been like decorkified, but when it opened in the early 80s was kind of this fantasy land version of like Siena or Italian hill towns, and kind of blew everybody's mind.
Yeah, that was amazing. I mean, it sounds fascinating, and I've gone down to San Diego and I was like, well, I've never seen this, and I guess that's why, is it's the times will catch back up to
No, it really, well, honestly, I think it should have been made a postmodern landmark, and they shouldn't have been able to, make it all gray and glass and, looking like everything else in 2022. But that is a fight that was not won.
Well, and Jurdy has such sort of an interest, and I guess using the inspiration from Bradbury, because Bradbury, if I took it correctly, basically it was like, people just need a place to be, right? Like they need a place to hang out and to do stuff, right? Because otherwise you're just going around sort of aimlessly. And then once you're at a place, then you can just sort of do that. But again, you're lost in a way that's interesting, because you're making new discoveries. And so basically it's essentially this idea that like a mall doesn't necessarily need to be tied to shopping on it doesn't always need to be shopping forward. You can have experiences and movie theaters and other things where people can go around and spend so much time there doing other things that eventually they pop into a store and buy new sneakers. Which is sort of the mall that I know it. Yeah, as I know it. Yeah.
Yeah, and he also talks about the importance of there being different kinds of spaces / different kinds of shops for different ages and stages of people. Like, one of my favorite bits that he talks about is that all malls should have an attic, and like what's up in the attic, it's like an antiquarian bookstore and a magic store, and he doesn't say an arcade, but like I really think the aesthetics of 80s arcades are totally part of that. Just, like it needs a back hall as well as like a front hall. So it's like the moms can hang out in the atrium under the palm trees, but the kids want to go in the dark corridor where there are things that feel like they're just for them.
Yes, exactly. And which is such a kind of brilliant point, like something truly for everyone.
Yeah.
So then that's the other. Jurdy also then goes on to design Universal City Walk, which is a very LA, very, I don't even know. I was there recently, and it just feels like sensory overload. And I think that's by design, right? I mean, in terms of the way, you can get lost, and there's these ramps and things. You're always sort of off balance at a place like that, I feel like.
Yeah. No, and that, it's like if the theme for Horton Plaza was Italian hill towns, the theme for Universal City Walk is Hollywood. It's like movie marquees and King Kong and all of that, but like crammed together all in one place, which is supposed to make it more exciting. And then Jurdy's final move is then to design the Mall of America in Bloomington, Minnesota, which literally has a whole roller coaster in the middle of the mall. Like the joke I've been making in other interviews is, the title of my book is Meet Me by the Fountain. Every mall has a fountain, but at Mall of America, the fountain is actually a giant roller coaster. That's the centerpiece. So, I mean, I think there's something really quite wild about thinking that up and making it happen. And and Jurdy's real innovation was, he said something about to make shopping beside the point. He thought the mall really had to move into being an entertainment zone, because shopping itself was not a draw for people anymore.
Absolutely. Well, I also, just briefly going back to City Walk, I think did he say that he got inspiration from Blade Runner?
Yes, he did.
A terrifying thought, honestly.
Yeah.
Only sometimes, a true visionary.
Sometimes you don't want to know people's references.
Yes, because now I look at it and I feel, you know what? Honestly, he kind of nailed it in that regard. But and Mall of America is so interesting because that's, I feel like in kind of Universal City Walk is similar, but it's attached to a theme park but it's literally the mall as a tourist destination, which is so interesting.
Yeah, it is. I mean, they literally had, daily flights essentially, to the Minneapolis airport, but to the Mall of America, because people would fly in, stay at a hotel, like on the mall property, spend the weekend entirely inside the mall, and then fly out, like never go to Minneapolis proper at all. And, I do think that at that time in the US, many fewer people traveled internationally. People, didn't fly as much for vacations. So the Mall of America actually seemed like a bargain because you could get so much in one place. And there was the roller coaster in the center, but then each of the wings of the mall had a different theme, and one was more European, like one was more New Orleans, one was more honky tonk. And so I think now if people want to go to New Orleans, they go to New Orleans. I mean, and New Orleans has too many tourists because of that. Or if they want to go to Paris, they go to Paris. Same. But at that time, that just wouldn't have been affordable for most people. And so the Mall of America, just like consolidated all into one place that was easier to get to. But I think we're in a very different tourism place now.
Definitely, yeah. And that's really interesting because obviously, and Jody is someone who was like very pro Disneyland, right? Which kind of like is that and I'm from Las Vegas, Nevada, which is sort of like adult Disneyland, and where you can see the Paris, the Venetian gondolas and everything just walking down the street, so that I kind of there's a soft spot. I have a soft spot for that idea of like cramming everything into one place and being like, I'm going to do it all in one day.
Yeah. Which is really not the best idea.
No, it's again overload a little bit. So you kind of describe those as sort of like there was the first wave of malls, there's a second wave of malls. Are we kind of in like are we technically in the third wave of malls now? Is this?
I feel like we're in probably the fourth wave, because after let's say the Jody entertainment malls, there were what you referred to as the lifestyle centers, which is basically a high-end indoor mall that's gone back outdoors.
Right.
These were always more popular in warmer climates. Like I think California always had more outdoor malls than other places. But during the 90s and early 2000s, there was a desire to try to make the mall fresh again by making places, well, the one in Durham, North Carolina is called the Shops at South Point, to make these outdoor malls that would still have, an anchor store at either end and shops in between, but maybe the path was more wandering and there were outdoor cafes and other sorts of things to kind of make it feel more like a real urban street.
Yes. With the Grove in Los Angeles.
Yes, the Grove is a great example. Yeah.
These sorts of, again, the Rick Caruso properties were a guy who wanted to create his own little town, complete with a trolley, who now is used that as a launching point to possibly become the mayor of Los Angeles. Which again, and the aesthetic of those are very interesting. Sorry, I would cut you off. What were you going to say?
Oh no, that's okay. Yeah, I mean, it's like it's much easier to be mayor of the Grove than it is to be mayor of Los Angeles.
Yes.
But yeah, I think again you can see people trying to kind of dress the same thing in new clothes. Like, I mean, that's how I really see the lifestyle centers. They didn't really move that far from the mall origins. They were just deployed in a different way, and generally with architecture that referred more specifically to the area that they were in. Like there are ones in the Southwest, they're all adobe. There are ones in Connecticut that have like white clapboarding, the most basic kind of scenography. But yeah, no, now, we're in kind of a wild zone of mall making that was only kind of made wilder by the pandemic. And so like I think a lot of different mall things happening at the same time.
So yeah, it kind of leads me to where you were writing the book, and essentially as you're writing the book, a pandemic breaks out, which is kind of the worst possible thing for a mall, a place where people can gather to shop in person and do these things, especially at a time where obviously online shopping is beginning to already pick off mall business and seems to only have exacerbated that to a certain extent. And so I guess in that way, what was that experience like for you, and being like, I love these things, I'm writing about these things, and now I might actively be watching, their downfall, I guess.
Yeah, I was definitely freaked out for the first few months, partially because I thought, initially my argument was going to be, yes, some malls are dying, but not all malls are dying. And I was like, wait, is that narrative completely exploded now? The other thing was just like, as a writer and researcher, I had, 6 months of mall tours all planned out. Like I had all these maps of places I was going to go. I was hoping to have a lot more kind of walk and talk experiences of going to people with malls. And basically I went to North Park in February 2020 and came back. And then that was it. Like everything else was canceled. So, I had a heart to heart with my editor about how we thought I could still write the book. And I don't think in the end it suffered from that, because honestly, a lot of the malls that I was talking about, especially historically, I really wanted to talk about how they were then, not how they were now, because I wanted to talk about their designers' intentions and like how they were covered and, kind of what their innovation was. So I found other ways, partially thanks to like a lot of YouTube videos of mall tours and historic news coverage. I mean, like there's a lot of mall material out there on the web, and I tried to dip into all of it. But what happened was, once the pandemic started going on, once we realized the pandemic was not going to be over in 3 months or whatever, I started talking to, mall analysts and experts, and they all said, and this has mostly been borne out, that the pandemic wasn't going to change the trajectories of malls. It just might accelerate their directions. Like it was going to become clearer, faster, which malls were going to survive and which malls were going to die. And they did up the percentage of malls that were going to die. But like, part of my basic argument is that, even if we started with approximately 1,200 malls, indoor malls before the pandemic, even if 35% of those end up not making it, that's still 700 to 800 live malls. And that's still an awful lot of malls. Like people have gotten the impression, because of very dramatic dead mall photography, that like all the malls are going to go away. And that's just not true. Like lots of them are alive and well. They tend to be the fancier malls. And I don't know what your experience is of the malls in Los Angeles, but like malls with a Nordstrom or a Saks or a Neiman Marcus are doing better than the rest of malls. It's kind of the middle to lower end malls that were really decimated by the demise of a lot of different department store brands.
Right. I mean, of, again, shadowing a sort of declining middle class in America in some ways.
I read a great article that said, like, people who have money, shop at Neiman Marcus. People who don't have money used to shop at Macy's, but now they shop at Target. And Target is usually a freestanding big box store, not in a mall. So you don't need to go to the mall to go to a Target. And that I feel like is very clear, and I think easy to understand. I mean, just looking at one's own behavior.
Yes, exactly.
But it's interesting, just like vis-a-vis online shopping, which you mentioned. Like before the pandemic, online shopping was about 15% of retail sales. It went up to like 30 to 35% of retail sales during the pandemic, but it's already coming back down. Like people did not love doing all of their shopping online. And, I know just from like my own anecdotal experience, like it became really frustrating, like all the packaging in your house having to order multiple sizes if like you don't, especially women's sizing is very crazy. I think that people do have a desire to go back to shopping in person, maybe not for everything, but definitely for some things.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just again, it's something to do, and
Yes.
which is kind of it's sort of the ultimate a platonic ideal of like, I'll go and they'll probably eat some food and I'll buy a shirt and I'll see a movie and I'll do, there's just, I think as human beings, we crave that sort of
Right.
order.
That sounds like a totally pleasant way to spend an afternoon.
Yes.
And yes, and the mall made it as easy as possible.
Yeah. And honestly, I was going to say a movie is like, I think people were freaking out about movies in the exact same way. It was malls. Like, will there ever be movie theaters? Will people ever leave their houses again to go pay to watch a movie? Which is obviously, I think, tied to malls, and in a lot of the best malls I ever had growing up had a movie theater in them. And the answer was yes. Billions of dollars have been spent at the box office since it was deemed safe to return. And I think people now, the types of movies, again, it's different. But anyway, and again, people want to go out. People want to see the world and do things in the world and interact with strangers and have communal experiences. And the mall is a great vector for that.
Yeah, I know. I think people want to be with people, and that's something that came up again and again in the mall literature that I was reading, and also just felt correct to me as a human and an observer of people in public spaces. Like, that doesn't change. No matter what century you're living in, there are some universal experiences that we just keep building different architectures for.
Yeah. So I guess now the question I would just sort of ask, because I guess you say we're in the fourth wave and things have gotten kind of interesting. Like, what is the future of the mall, or like, what is the future draw of the mall? And I guess I'll refer quickly back to the Eddie DeBartolo Sr. His son, Eddie DeBartolo Jr., eventually bought the San Francisco 49ers, of whom I'm a huge fan.
Okay.
And it's still in the DeBartolo family to this day. And it's something I've noticed with now sports franchises are trying to do this. They built a new stadium in Santa Clara with the intention of essentially having a city center pop up around the stadium and essentially a mall, sort of like an LA Live with Staples Center, now crypto.com. Or Stan Kroenke, who built the SoFi Center in Inglewood, that bought, thousands of acres there with the sort of the same intention of having what is essentially a mall there. Is that a thing, something, having an anchor store that's literally a pro sports team? Is that kind of where we're headed? Maybe
that is one of the directions that we're headed in. I think in most places, in most towns, like the anchor store that's actually a sports stadium is instead some kind of experience place, like a trampoline park, or like a really fabulous climbing center. Like we have Brooklyn Boulders here. I don't know if that's a franchise or not. Or I read about Sears in North Vancouver that's going to be turned into an indoor mountain biking arena. So I think the sports stadiums ones are kind of like the deluxe example. But the point is, what will make people leave their houses, and what can they do like as a family? And so like in San Francisco or in LA, like that can be a sports stadium, but in, a smaller place, that can be a trampoline park where everyone has their birthdays, or you go on a rainy day and you can spend hours and just like have a good time. So I think it's experiences. And then the other kind of replacement anchor, as you might call it, is really food experiences. And that goes back to the festival marketplaces as well. So markets where you can buy special foods, but also eat in, and do your grocery shopping, maybe have like different kinds of restaurants. North Park installed an Eataly during the pandemic that I think is doing pretty well. And so Eataly, again, is at the high end, but there are lower end versions of this. And in some places, there are older malls that have been kind of taken over and redone to specifically attract the local community, which is often an immigrant community. So, malls no longer just for white people. And so there are Latinx malls and African malls and Asian American malls of all different types, where again, food is a really important part of the whole mix of stores, but other things are also sold.
I mean, just even stepping back for a second too, because you sort of talk about, you quote, I didn't expect a Chris Rock quote in the book, but it was so interesting of like the idea that there became the quote unquote black malls, which were essentially old white malls that white people didn't go to anymore. But they still made almost as much money, or if even more money. And it's like people not realizing that it's like, well, money, you know, I guess capitalism will eventually bear that out. And it's like, money is money. And so it's interesting to see that that's sort of the future of, I guess, in many ways of like, right, there are these specialized places and it's like people will still happily take, you know, dollars, those right. Dollars. Yeah.
I mean, the difference is, I mean, like the Chris Rock quote, as with much of his comedy, is really like it's a bitter quote, right? It's nobody's making a mall for us. We have to take the old mall, which you know, is not right. I mean, the positive thing about a lot of these new, let's call them ethnocentric marketplaces, is that often the developers are from the community, or it's somebody that is specifically making over malls in a lot of places that say now have a higher Latinx population to address that community's needs. So it's less exploitative, and it's really kind of like positively turning to the newly diverse suburbs and giving people that are living in those suburbs what they need. And what they need is no longer like the old version of the mall.
Yeah, that's actually really, that is a nice upshot actually for a change. So, I mean, we're kind of wrapping up here. I guess I'll ask you one last question, which is, so if you could sort of describe your perfect day at the mall, what would it be?
Let's see. Well, if you're doing kind of like a lightning round on mall food, I would definitely be eating at Auntie Anne's rather than Cinnabon.
Yes.
I would like to go to the movies, like maybe a romantic comedy. I would actually like to browse in a Nordstrom, because living in New York City, I never get to see all the like fancy dresses and designer shoes. So I would like to browse in a Nordstrom, but then I would probably be more likely to actually buy clothes at, you know, Zara, or if I was very lucky and the mall had a Muji store, I would be into that.
Mujis are great. That's a great store.
Yeah. They do have one. I also do not like Hudson Yards, but they do have a Muji store.
Oh, okay. All right. The Hudson Yards hot take to close this out.
Yes.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time and doing the research and writing this fascinating book that I will not stop talking about for the next 6 months at least. And so just to quickly, I'll wrap things up. Thanks again for joining us here on Skylight Books Podcast. You can grab Alexandra's book, Meet Me by the Fountain, in our main location at 1818 Vermont Avenue. It's going to be in the nonfiction section. Run out and get it right away. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for listening to the Skylight Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylightbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.